Hello and welcome. I am Marie Pareto-Hedin, president of the Tufts Senior Connection, a shared interest group sponsored by the Tufts University Office of Alumni Engagement. We design in-person and online programs that we hope will be of special interest to alums ages 55 and older, but we welcome persons of all ages who find our programs relevant, intriguing, or both. Music has universal appeal. We may like different music genres, but we all like music because it relaxes us, or energizes us, or simply because we enjoy the sound. But is there more to music than pleasure? Associate Professor of Psychology Elizabeth Race, whose research focuses on the neural basis of learning and memory, is investigating the use of music as a tool to activate the brain and combat memory loss in older adults. Dr. Race, a cognitive neuroscientist, earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Duke University and a PhD in neuroscience from Stanford University. Following her PhD, Dr. Race completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Memory Disorders Research Center located at Boston University and the VA Boston healthcare system. A member of the Tufts faculty since 2015, she teaches courses in Introduction to Psychology, Brain and Behavior, and Neuroscience. Dr. Race's research seeks to explain the cognitive and neural mechanisms supporting human learning, memory, and cognitive control. Professor Race, welcome to the Senior Connection, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that nice introduction. I'm really happy to be with all of you today and to share a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing here in Tufts at my lab. So the title of my talk is Music and Memory in the Aging Brain. And what I want to start with is really the last piece here. So really thinking about the aging brain, what do we know about the aging brain? And then coming back to this idea of music and memory and how they might interact and influence us as we're aging. So how does the brain change with age? Well, we can bring individuals into the lab and have them undergo an MRI scan, and we can take pictures of the brain and look at anatomical differences in younger and older adults. And when we do this, we can see striking differences between older and younger adults. So you'll see in this slide, this is an MRI image of a younger, or you could call this middle-aged adult, 42 years, and an older adult. And you can see just from the MRI images with your naked eye that there's some differences between the two brains, right? The older brain you can see has more atrophy, there's less cortical thickness, there's volume loss, their ventricles here in the middle of the brain are larger. So we can see this with the naked eye that there's some changes that go on in the brain with age. But this picture doesn't really tell the whole story. So while some regions are particularly vulnerable to age-related neurodegeneration, other regions really aren't, and they remain preserved across the lifespan. So not all brain regions are similarly vulnerable to age-related neurodegeneration, which is an interesting piece of information to keep in mind. In addition, we really see substantial individual variability. So aging is really a story of immense individual variability. So you might recognize this in your own life. So you might be maybe not looking at individuals' brains all the time, but you might notice cognitive variability in peers and colleagues and friends. There's a lot of variability as we age in terms of our cognition. So some older adults are more affected by age-related cognitive decline, and others remain sharp as a tack well into their 90s. So there's a lot of individual variability there, and that's something we're really interested in, because if we know something about this variability and the relationship between the brain changes and cognitive function changes, this will really be key as we try to think about designing interventions or other ways to combat or address age-related cognitive decline. So how does the brain change with age? So here's a few key players that we know do change as we get older. So on the left, we have the prefrontal cortex. So this is the outer frontal part of the frontal lobes of the brain. And then in the middle, we have the hippocampus, which is a region in the medial temporal lobes, way in the middle of the brain. And both of these regions we know change with age. They're highly interconnected. And maybe not surprisingly, these are both regions that are really important for long-term memory function. So in particular, they support episodic forms of memory. So this refers to memory for episodes or events. And you can think of these as rich kind of contextual memories for associations. So for example, if you see someone walking down the street and you might recognize them, you might have memory for that person, but you might have less associations that make that kind of a rich contextual memory. So for example, you might know that you know that person, but you can't retrieve their name. So is their name Gloria? So you have some memory there, but you don't have the associations. Or maybe you recognize the face, but you might not know where you met this person. So do I know this person because I do yoga with them, or I did yoga with them last week, or were they in a book club that I attended in the past? And it's really these forms of episodic, rich, associative memories that we see depend on the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex and are particularly vulnerable to age-related changes. So let's zoom in on the hippocampus for a minute. So this is a cross-section of a brain. Here's the MRI, and it's showing the hippocampus in a young adult on the top, on the left and right. And you'll see there's a lot of tissue here. So this is gray matter, cortical tissue here, and the hippocampus right in the red. So in a healthy aging brain, you can notice just here that there's less tissue. So we see atrophy in the hippocampus here. And interestingly, as is the story with a lot of cognitive and brain aging, the changes seem to be magnified in age-related diseases. So for example, Alzheimer's disease here, you'll see the atrophy is really magnified and you start seeing lesions in the hippocampus as well. So we see across age that the hippocampal volume is going to decline. This is due to a lot of things going on at the cellular level. There's less neurogenesis, less synaptic plasticity. We have fewer dendrites. The shape of neurons are changing. We're losing neurons. And so this all leads to atrophy and then therefore some cognitive impairments that we observe, such as the ones I mentioned, like encoding and retrieving long-term memories, these episodic memories from our lives. We see similar changes in the prefrontal cortex. So this is a young adult MRI on the top, and then a middle-aged and older adult. And you can probably notice some changes here. I want to orient you to the frontal cortex here, where you'll see is larger and with thicker tissue in the young adult and the middle-aged, and less so in the older adult. So we see this atrophy in the older adult brain in the prefrontal cortex. But what's really interesting here is that the prefrontal cortex is really heterogeneous. It's a big brain region. There's lots of subregions. And lateral regions on the outside are particularly susceptible to age-related atrophy. So we see what's called, or what's been labeled, this prefrontal lateral to medial shift with age. So here we have a bunch of subregions in the lateral prefrontal cortex. These are most affected with age. Whereas these regions in the middle part here, if you kind of cut away the brain and look on them in the medial portion, those are much more preserved. So these lateral PFC functions that are things like executive function, planning, organizing memory, searching memory, right? So being able to retrieve a certain name, you know it, but you have to pull it out of memory. These functions seem to be most affected and they're associated with these lateral regions. Whereas the functions supported by medial prefrontal cortex are more relatively intact. So for example, the retrieval of more remote memory, so farther in time, maybe from childhood. Interestingly, the medial prefrontal cortex is also associated with our sense of self. So you might be familiar with the notion that when memories are related to yourself, when they're relevant, self-relevant, you can remember them better. This region's also really highly kind of associated with motivation. It has a lot of dopaminergic projections. You can think of this as reward processing. But also what we'll get to later is that you see activation in these medial regions with music as well. So I wanted to pause here and have a little interim exercise. So I can't see any of you, so I won't know if you're cheating. So you don't have to participate, but if you want to, I'm going to give you a little memory test. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to give you a list of about 16 words, and I'm going to show you them one at a time, and I'd like you to try to remember them. And then I'll ask you to retrieve them in a little bit. So the only task here is to remember these words. So don't write them down yet, just remember them. Okay, here we go. Okay. So now I'd like you can pull out a piece of paper if you want to, or type on your keyboard. Try to remember as many of those words as you can. Normally in the lab, we give this kind of memory test, there'd be a delay. So there'd be, a 30-second delay, 15-minute delay, maybe even a day-long delay. But what I'd like you to do just now is try to recall as many words as you can. So I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. Okay. So it's not really fair. I'm not giving you a whole lot of time, but just for illustration purposes, I wanted you to kind of put yourself in the shoes of a lot of participants in our experiments, because I think it can help you relate to the data that I'm about to show a little bit better. So here's the correct result, the correct answer. So you can kind of go through and see how many did you remember? How many could you accurately remember? Were you kind of clustering items together? Did you remember the ones at the beginning better than the end? We can learn a lot of really interesting things about memory based on your performance. But the one thing I wanted to note here is just the pattern that we typically see as we age. So in this kind of memory recall task, if we look at the average or the mean number of words recalled, you'll see that younger adults will average about 14. There were 16 total. Older adults will be a little bit lower. So you'll see about 11, sometimes 10. So there's a fewer number of items that are recalled in memory. What you also might note is that there's a lot of variability here. And again, this is important. So there's a huge amount of variability just in healthy young adults, healthy older adults. So it's not kind of a one size fits all, but you can see that on average, the younger adults tend to perform better than the older adults. Now, what's important here is that we see age-related changes in memory performance that are related to these two regions, the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. So another thing to note here is that there are individuals, older adults, that perform way up here. So what's going on with these individuals? Can remember more or the same amount as younger adults. These are called super agers. This is a big area of research in memory. Looking at these older adults whose memory performance is equal or better than younger adults. And what we see is that they have preserved integrity of the medial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So the idea here is that youthful memory might be related to more youthful brain regions. And we can look here, and what these plots are showing are just the thickness of the medial prefrontal cortex on the left and the hippocampus on the right, and memory performance is plotted on the y-axis. So what this is telling you on the left and the right is the thicker or more cortical tissue you have in the medial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, the better your memory performance. So the greater number of items that you'll be able to recall in this task. And you can see two of the individuals here with the smallest hippocampus, for example, and the largest are shown on the right over here in the green and the red. And you can see how they perform. The smaller hippocampus performs worse on the memory test than the individual with the larger hippocampus. Okay, so that's telling us something about the brain changes with age. We see changes in lateral prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, but the medial prefrontal cortex seems to be okay. And this is related to kind of impaired and preserved memory function. But we also see changes in network connectivity. So not just the regions of the brain themselves changing, but how they're talking to each other. So this is often thought of as a disconnected brain. So you see kind of weaker connectivity between brain regions. This is because the white matter integrity changes over time. And this leads to slower or disrupted communication. And in the lab, we study this by looking at EEG signals. So you can put an EEG cap on someone, measure electrical signals of the brain, and we can see these neural oscillations, which are these waveforms. This is showing us neural activity. And what you can see as you get older is that you see less synchronized neural oscillations. So different brain regions the oscillations don't line up with each other. And so this is telling us that they might not be communicating as strongly. And indeed, we see in the kind of extreme case of Alzheimer's disease, we see reductions in two kinds of frequency bands. These are just the frequency, how fast they're oscillating. In the delta, so low frequency, 2 to 4 hertz, and theta, 4 to 8 hertz bands. So you can see that this coupling across regions is reduced. The blue is showing reduction in Alzheimer's disease. And indeed, just if we look at HC as healthy control, older adults and Alzheimer's disease, there's a strong correlation between cognitive ability and how much synchronization you have in the brain. So the more synchronization, the better cognitive performance, and reduced synchronization, you have reduced cognitive ability. Okay, so now you've had a little primer on the aging brain. And one of the things that we're really interested in my lab at Tufts is thinking about what can we learn about the brain, and then how can we use that knowledge to think about ways that we can enhance memory across the lifespan. So you can do this in two ways. You can think about tapping into brain circuits that are preserved with age, or boosting or circumventing these circuits that are impaired with age. And so one way that we can do this is through a field that's really rapidly growing, which is neurostimulation. And music you can think of as a special case of this. So music has this ability to kind of reach into the brain, to stimulate a lot of different brain regions. So it can be a really nice, safe, non-invasive, even pleasurable way of neurostimulation. So I wanted to just highlight the close relationship between music and memory with a trailer for a really wonderful documentary called Alive Inside. I would highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. So I'm just going to show this trailer really quick to illustrate this relationship.
What do you think of music?
My heart belongs to music. I love it.
Have you ever had music just hit you in a place that immediately brought you to tears? Music has that power.
Music connects people with who they have been, who they are in their lives. Because what happens when you get old is all the things you're familiar with and your identity are all just being peeled away.
We're going to do your medicine now.
Our healthcare system imagines the human to be a very complicated machine. We have medicines that can adjust the dials. Blood pressure, oh, turn that down. Blood sugar, oh, turn that down. We haven't done anything to touch the heart and soul of a patient.
One resident that barely opened her eyes, she didn't respond. Knew her for 2 years. Once we put the iPod on her, she started shaking her feet. She started moving her head. It was amazing.
Music has more ability to activate more parts of the brain than any other stimulus.
Who am I?
Huh?
Who am I? I'm your daughter.
By exciting or awakening those pathways, we have a gateway to stimulate and reach somebody who otherwise is unreachable.
It can't get away from me if I'm in this place.
It takes me back to my school days. Oh, God, that's beautiful.
Does it make you happy to sing for us?
Yeah. I'm crying.
Every human being needs stimulation from the outside, from little babies to old people.
American culture is wrong. There is actually life beyond adulthood. There's the opportunity to live and grow and become elders. The aging that we experience holds in it very important learnings and lessons.
There is no pill that does that.
Okay. So I think something that clip illustrates is not only the power of music to evoke emotions, to kind of stimulate the body, the brain, the mind, but also this kind of really subjective experience of kind of traveling through time to a different place. And this is really a core of a lot of what we think of as long-term memory. So when you listen to a piece of music that might be familiar from a certain time in your childhood, for example, we know that this can evoke really strong autobiographical memories. It can transport you back to a time, maybe when you had a special lullaby for a child, or a song when you were falling in love, or your wedding, or the Tufts fight song that can take you back to your time at Tufts. And so music can really serve as a really important memory retrieval cue. But music is also really important for new learning and memory. So you can think of an example of the ABCs, right? When you're learning the ABCs, you often might kind of think of the tune or learn it to a tune. And if, in fact, I asked you what letter comes before G in the alphabet, you might have to kind of sing A, B, C, D, E. Oh, okay, now I can get there, right? So it's not only for memory retrieval, but we know that music is really an important tool for memory encoding as well. And so one question we have is, what is this relationship? Where does this come from? And we can ask this question by looking at how music influences the brain. So I'm going to play you a little clip of music and then tell you what's happening in your brain while you're listening to it. So this clip is going to be a clip that we actually use in the lab. So I'll bring up some data from it later. So it's relevant to listen to. Okay, so hopefully some of you might have been noticing you're tapping your toe, maybe tapping a finger, right? So you kind of pick up on the rhythm of this music, which we'll come back to later when I show you some data. But what was happening in your brain when you're sitting there listening to music? So if you were in the scanner, we'd see a whole lot going on. So when you're at rest, you see activity in the brain. You might be mind wandering, thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. But when you listen to music, you see a lot of different brain regions are active. So music has this kind of holistic way of engaging the brain, but certain regions are particularly engaged. So maybe not surprisingly, the auditory cortex, the region of the brain on the left and right side that processes sound, is going to be active, but also some of the players that we talked about before. So you see activity in the medial prefrontal cortex right here, also in more posterior medial regions. Here is the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe. Right above it is the auditory cortex. So again, sound, so you'd see auditory activity. But some of these players that we saw before, so again, these regions that are really important for memory are also engaged when we listen just passively to music. And this was a study done by Peter Janata that was looking at a lot of different medial prefrontal regions. So it's not just one region that's engaged with music. It might actually be dependent on the type of music. For example, here, the regions in green respond more strongly to familiar versus unfamiliar songs. Red are regions that are engaged in particular for music that evokes autobiographical memories. And blue are regions that are engaged when someone reports that the music was pleasant. And so the idea here is that we see regions of the brain are active when you listen to music that are also active when we're retrieving memories and encoding memories. And so we see a relationship here between the activity for music and activity for memory. And interestingly here, again, this medial PFC region is really the last to go as we age. So we see this relative preservation that I mentioned earlier. And in Alzheimer's and dementia, it's one of the last regions that we see atrophy. So again, it might be a good region to tap into if we want to boost up memory performance. And indeed, we can see this in a handful of music-based intervention studies. So this is a recent study where they had older adults listen to music for 8 weeks. They recorded information about their music listening and had weekly check-ins with the music therapist. And what was really interesting about this is they also had scans of the brains before and after the intervention. And what they found is that there's connectivity differences in the brain following this music-based intervention. So what I'm showing you at the top is just younger adults before the intervention. They were in the group as well, and you see auditory cortex, medial prefrontal cortex. In the older adults, you see many similar regions, but less engagement of the medial prefrontal cortex. So even though you might see activity here, it's less compared to the younger adults. But strikingly, in the older adults, after the intervention, here you see this medial prefrontal cortex even more engaged. So it seems like this music intervention can really activate this region. And this is just connectivity between the auditory cortex and this medial region that becomes strengthened over time with this intervention. Another interesting study was looking at just volume of the different cortical regions in older adults and how that might be associated with musical experience. This is really hard to study, but in this study, what they found was that they had a variety of individuals, older adults with a variety of musical training. So some of them had very little musical training, some of them had more. And then they gave them a musical questionnaire asking questions about musical behaviors. So they could kind of group them into more trained and less trained individuals. And when they looked at the volume of all these different brain regions, they saw across frontal regions, this is medial temporal lobe, parahippocampal regions next to the hippocampus, and other regions of the middle part of the frontal cortex, there was a positive association between training over time, just lifetime training in music, and just the volume of these regions. So one thing that we've been really interested in is whether music can support memory functions by changing activity in the brain. So not just kind of volumes and amount of tissue, but how different brain regions are talking to each other. So I mentioned before, we see asynchronous rhythmic activity in older adults. And one of our hypotheses is that music might be able to synchronize this rhythmic activity. So how do we study that? So one way we can do that is with EEG in the lab. And when I have participants come in and they listen to music, we usually give them rhythmic music like the one I played for you. And what you see is that the oscillations in the brain that we can measure with EEG, these EEG caps, start to mirror the oscillations or rhythms that are present in the music. So here's just the acoustic envelope showing you some of the features of the music. And you can pick up rhythmic information from this. These are just the notes, an example of note being played. And what this is showing is that the music might have a 1 hertz beat. So the rhythm's 1 hertz. And if we look at what's happening in the brain, we can look at the EEG signals, and all of a sudden they'll start showing peaks at the same frequency as the music. So we'll see this mirroring of this 1 hertz frequency that's in music in the oscillations in the brain. And this is called neural entrainment. The idea that the neural activity, the oscillations, the rhythmic firing of neural activity in the brain really tracks these rhythms in the environment. And so again, it's a way of kind of stimulating or changing our brain activity through this really nice non-invasive method of music. And really what I want to point out here is that rhythm is key. So we've been really interested in rhythm for a lot of different reasons, but there's many different features of music you can look at. We're really honing in on rhythm because it has this ability to change the frequency of oscillations in the brain. And so what I'm going to show you here is that the brain is really tuned to rhythm. And one of the arguments for this is that kind of innate response to rhythms. So what we see in little babies in this clip I'm going to show you is that we see this kind of innate response, this pleasurable response to rhythm, but also this kind of synchronizing of motor activity with the beat. So here's an example of a little baby. You'll see how their behavior changes with music. Okay, so pretty good beat following. So the baby picks up on this music, you can see the behavior changes, emotions change, but also this kind of motor movement that happens automatically, the synchronization to music. And we see this in large concerts with large audiences, right? Everyone seems to kind of be able to jump to the beat, to move to the beat. And this is really automatic. And we can take advantage of this kind of entrainment of our body movements to rhythm in music therapy. So this is another example I'm going to show you of Parkinson's disease. So rhythmic training can be used as a music therapy tool in Parkinson's disease. And this is just one example I'm going to show you. This is a little bit longer clip showing how music and rhythm can help Parkinson's patients with gait shuffling. So gait shuffling tends to be one of the signs of Parkinson's disease, and you'll see in this kind of diagram here, before rhythmic training, you see this kind of high cadence, asymmetrical steps, short stride length. But after rhythm is introduced, you have much longer stride length, lower cadence, and more symmetrical steps. So here's an example of that.
To kind of post a video letting everybody know about this cool little study I came across. It's actually been out for quite a while, but I didn't know about it, so I wanted to, let other therapists know. I've had great results with this guy. We're going to demonstrate walking with no music first, just to kind of show the gait pattern. He's got Parkinson's, and so usually, he's got the typical kind of shuffling gait pattern and difficulty with smooth gait cadence. Then I'll show a video with the music, and you'll see the difference. Okay? Tennis balls. Forgot about that. Okay, so now we're going to do gait training with music. Everybody's got cell phones. Everybody nowadays has music on their phone, so this is just kind of a real easy way to do it. We'll stand here for a minute. We'll get the rhythm. Once we feel it, then we'll take off.
Okay, so you can see in that demonstration that music has a really important impact on movement, but there's really been much less research into the effects of music on memory more directly. A couple of preliminary studies I just wanted to mention briefly. One of them was done in at the Pickauer Institute, where they've done some really interesting work looking at auditory tone stimulation in rodent models. And what they find is that just stimulating with auditory tones, in this case 40 hertz stimulation, increases gamma oscillations of the same frequency in the brain. It also improves spatial and recognition memory and leads to changes in amyloid buildup in the prefrontal cortex. But again, this is just kind of auditory tones. So what about in humans? We don't have a lot of data. This is one data point looking at a kind of neurostimulation that uses alternating currents. And what happens here is you can see that using this stimulation, you can see oscillation in the prefrontal cortex and temporal cortex start to align. And this is work done by Rob Reinhardt at BU. And what he did is he found when he gave younger and older adults a memory test, so remember these items, and then they have to recall them. Older adults here in the light gray are not performing as well as the younger adults. But once they've had the stimulation, then all of a sudden their memory performance is just as similar to the younger adults. So something about kind of aligning these frequencies is really helping their memory. And so what we've investigated is using music in a similar manner in younger and then in older adults. So this is just one study I'm going to describe where we have individuals study faces in the context of music. So they come into the lab, they listen to that same clip of music or similar one that I had you listen to before, and they view faces. And then we give them a surprise memory test and say, did you see this face before? We're recording EEG during this time. So we can do two things. One is we can look at the changes in the neural oscillations in the brain. So this is a measure of neural entrainment. So what we see is if we play them a rhythm, the rhythm of the music I showed you was 1.25 hertz. We see in the brain power and phase coherence at these same frequencies. So these are just a measure of neural entrainment. The point here is that they're at the same frequency as the external music. So what we see in younger adults is significant neural entrainment. I'm just going to point you to the 1.25 hertz oscillation here. So this is a measure of neural entrainment. We see a lot more power in the brain at this frequency and what we call harmonic frequencies, which are related to this. Demonstrating that individuals are showing entrainment. Importantly, we also found a relationship between neural entrainment and memory performance. So what we found here on the left is that for faces that people remembered, we showed greater neural entrainment compared to faces that they later forgot. So this is telling us that there's some relationship between how much your brain is entraining to that music and how much you're going to remember a particular face. We also saw across participants, so each dot here is an individual, that individuals that had stronger neural entrainment had a greater effect of rhythm on memory. So again, there's a lot of variability here. This is just in younger adults, but individuals that entrain better, and some don't entrain so well, have more of an effect of rhythm on memory. So what happens in the aging brain? So this is preliminary work that we've done. Right now, our sample is 18 participants. What we did is have participants come into the lab, again, same paradigm, we listened to music and we said, first of all, do we even see this synchronization to music? So we played the music and we looked at the brain. And what was really exciting for us is that, yes, we do see this. So entrainment seems to be preserved in older adults. Their brain rhythms are oscillating at the same frequency as the music in a similar manner to younger adults. What was also interesting here is we asked, well, what components of music matter, right? So the music stimulus that I had you listen to was rich. It had a beat, it had instruments playing, it had melody. So what components of music really matter? And we were really hoping we could hone in on rhythm. So if we just strip away all the other features of music and just have rhythm, do we see the same kind of changes in the brain? So we gave participants a simple beat, again, same frequency, and a more complex syncopated beat, but at the same frequency. And what was interesting is that we, again, found even when stripped down to just the rhythm, we saw that the brain tracks this kind of environmental sound in the same way. So this is telling us that even when we take away the other features of music, the brain is responding and changing its activity pattern in alignment with that external rhythm. So rhythm seems to be really key here. Just really briefly, I wanted to show you that we've also done this study in a cohort of individuals that have Parkinson's disease. And I won't go through the data, but it basically looks very similar. So we see the same kind of pattern of preserved responses in the brain to music in individuals with Parkinson's disease. So finally, I wanted to end on some points about individual variability. So I brought this up at the beginning, and again, we see a lot of variability in cognitive performance, in memory performance, and in the brain as we age. So one thing we wanted to look at was beat perception ability. So I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but basically we gave individuals what's called a beat alignment task, which measures how well you can tap to a beat. So for example, you might think of friends who can really clap along to a beat, and other people you look at, you're at a concert and they're really off. So how well can you pick up on a beat? This is just a behavioral measure, and this was designed by Ani Patel here at Tufts. And what was interesting is that we found there's a lot of variability. Some people are really good at this bat task. Some people are not so good. But what we found is the rhythmic entrainment effect really depended on how well the individuals can track a beat on the bat performance, but just in the older adults. So people had better performance in the younger adults if they could detect a beat more accurately. But in both the low bat, people that didn't score so well, and the high bat performers, we saw rhythmic entrainment effects, but this wasn't the case for older adults. So you can see this blue bar is really only higher in the older adults that can feel the beat. So we see individual variability in both the brain and in behavior, but this effect really seems to be important in older adults. So it may be that the effects of music on the brain and behavior are going to be different in older adults depending on these individual variability factors. And some of them we're looking at are both neural factors as well as these behavioral factors, which you can think of maybe being related to musical experience. Okay, so with that, I'm going to end. I know there's questions in the chat, which I'll get to, but first I just wanted to thank the two graduate students that did most of this work, Paige Hickey and Hunter Jandro, and also my collaborator, Ani Patel here at Tufts, who's done a lot of work helping design these studies. We also had funding from the Grammy Museum for this work. And I also wanted to leave you with a couple of other kind of resources. So if you'd like to learn more, I'd highly recommend this book by Oliver Sacks, Musicophilia. It has some wonderful case studies about individuals who either, are kind of beat deaf or tone deaf or are really good at performing music. So this is a really nice accessible book. And then this is a more of a scientific paper. Here's Ani Patel at Tufts. Here's one of the co-authors. I'm looking at some of the variabilities and how music might be used, different types of music might be used in kind of interventions and music-based interventions. Okay, so I'm going to go, I'll stop there on my slides and go to some of the questions. Let me scroll up. Okay. So the first question that I see is, how do the changes in perimenopause and menopause connect with the general changes associated with aging? So this is an excellent question, and I'm going to have a really unsatisfying answer in that we don't know. We do know a little bit, but not very much. There has really been not a lot of research into middle age, kind of the perimenopause age. It's kind of overlooked, right? And even in my own work here, we said kind of we have younger adults, we have older adults, which is 65 or older, but what happens in the middle? So we don't really know. We don't know how hormonal changes might be influencing changes in the brain, in particular changes in memory. A colleague of mine, Natasha Rajaram, is actually doing a really big grant-funded study on just this question. So she is in Canada, and she, I know, has some really interesting results from this, but it's not published yet. But the kind of one of the points that she's raised is that it does matter, right? So we do see differences in this middle-aged group, particularly in women, another group that hasn't been studied kind of separately. Usually we kind of smush groups together. But there's some really interesting results there. So I'd say I don't know the answer here, but there's changes in both these hippocampal and frontal regions that we know are different in perimenopause, and this does influence memory performance. A second question I see. Is it a particular frequency range or particular frequency of music that matters, or type of music? So this is another excellent question. So what I have tried to do a little bit in the lab is really strip music down to rhythm, as I mentioned before. So we think that rhythm is really a critical piece here. So most music, not all music, and again, this is biased towards Western music, but usually a lot of music has some kind of underlying beat. And for our work, when we're really interested in neural oscillations, that's a key component that we've looked at. So rhythm seems to be really important here, but we don't know about the specific frequency, and that's something that we're investigating. So the frequencies that we've looked at so far are the kind of low frequency, what's called the delta band, which is about 2 to 4 hertz. Why did we start there? Well, a lot of biological rhythms that are natural in the environment, like music, like speech, the rhythms of speech, the rhythms of motor movement, are all fall in this kind of low frequency delta range. So that seems to be a good place to start, particularly in music, because it's the most frequent frequency. But even within that, I said 2 to 4 hertz, there's a range. And we're really interested in looking at individual variability, even within that frequency band, to understand whether, maybe someone's on the higher end of that or lower end of that in terms of how quickly they can entrain to environmental rhythms like music. And that might be really important. I have an honors student in the lab who's going to be looking at questions like that coming up. So again, hopefully we'll have more satisfying answers. But one thing that my graduate student Paige did look at is higher frequencies. So a neat thing about neural oscillations is that they can couple together. So even if we play music at a low frequency, it will affect higher frequency oscillations in the brain. This is a phenomenon called cross-frequency coupling. So what Paige found is that it actually is this coupling that seems to be really important in terms of the effect of music on memory. So it's not just how kind of your auditory cortex is tracking the musical beat, but it's how that beat gets passed on to other brain regions that could be really key. And what's interesting is some of the work I mentioned in the from Pick Hour Institute was really high frequency gamma oscillations, 40 hertz. And that's actually the same kind of frequency range where we see this coupling is really important. So long story short is that it's probably multiple frequencies, but it could be that your brain's picking up on these lower frequencies that evolutionarily we've been kind of tuned to pick up on because they're in our environment. But that doesn't mean that's the only thing that's being affected in the brain. We could also influence higher frequencies by way of a coupling to these lower frequencies. Let me look at the next question. So there's a couple questions on kind of movement, dancing, which is a kind of another type of musical experience. And it's actually in the slide that I'm showing here, kind of the idea between what can we think of this kind of receptive music-based interventions where we might be just passively listening to music, which has primarily been the work that we've done, versus more active music-based interventions. So you can imagine singing in a group or performing with a group. So dancing is the same kind of thing. There's actually a Dance for Parkinson's event that goes on every spring here at Tufts, which is really interesting to think about the importance of dance and music and movement all together on Parkinson's disease. And indeed, we do know that the physical activity part of dance is really important, and moving to a rhythm is really important. And this can also have other types of effects on the aging brain that are really helpful. So the kind of coupling of the movement with the listening to music can be even more effective potentially. And we don't really know why, but one thing could be the kind of social interaction can be very important too. So that could be kind of complementary additional contribution, or it could interact with the music itself. And we don't really know the answer to that. But there's a lot of work going into looking at kind of therapeutic interventions that might not just be kind of passive, receptive kind of musical experiences, but more active experiences. Let me look through. Okay, so here's one. Yeah, there's another one singing in a choir, guitar singing, same thing. So another question is, how can we senior citizens experiencing memory loss already use music as one means to limit further memory loss? So this is a difficult question because there haven't been that many longitudinal studies. The couple that I mentioned before in terms of interventions, which again are hard to do, but have been promising. So they've shown that listening to music, and again, this is in that study, it was more self-selected music. But we think, we would argue that maybe rhythmic music might be particularly stimulating in the brain. But listening to music has been shown to change the brain. So not only in the moment when you're listening to music, but over time, which these longitudinal studies have found, or these intervention studies have found. So I would say, I don't want to prescribe anything. We don't know exactly, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And it seems like listening to music, kind of taking that that kind of stimulation or participating in music activities can change the brain and in brain regions that we think are important for memory, and in ways in terms of the kind of neural synchrony that we think can boost up some functions that might be changing with age. Okay, let me look and see. So if we wanted to help individuals diagnosed with dementia, what music would be best to play for memory? Music that is familiar to them, or the frequency rhythm? I had a couple of, here's a couple of these outstanding questions that we're investing in the lab are relevant to some of these questions. But this question kind of touches on the point of kind of familiarity and how much someone might like the music, right? So if they're familiar or they choose the music themselves, one idea is that it might have a particularly strong effect. So does the type of music matter? We think, again, the rhythm might be really important, having a strong beat. But things like personal relevance or familiarity might matter, especially when you're thinking about kind of dementia and difficulty recalling information, really relying on these past experiences that might be able to be evoked through music in these patients. Alive Inside is a great demonstration of that. What's interesting in our results, we do ask participants how much they liked the music. Did they find it pleasant or not? And you might have noticed in our clip, maybe you really didn't like that, or maybe you kind of found it groovy. You can actually measure something called groove. And we have not found that association yet. However, I'll note we have small samples and we've only used certain types of music. So I think that's the next step for us, is to look at a range of different types of music, either familiar music that individuals choose themselves, or music that might be rated as higher in terms of likability or pleasantness. And I think that that would probably be the most powerful. That's my guess, but we haven't had data to speak to that yet. But there is work showing that familiarity and likability for recalling autobiographical memories of the past, particularly in individuals with dementia, can be particularly effective. Let's see. Another one, are there simple strategies to implement into our musical programming for seniors? So I think it depends on what the programming is, but what I tell people when I do this type of research is, there doesn't seem to be a lot of harm. So I would suggest music, particularly in, senior centers, and having seniors engage with music and also listen to music. The nice thing about music is that you can enjoy it and get benefits from it, even if you're physically limited, which we know, happens as we get older. There's going to be more physical limitations. So even just having music in the background can be helpful in terms of the stimulation and engagement. But also kind of tailoring in the Alive Inside, they reference this again, is having, individuals choose music that might be particularly salient to them, that they might enjoy. We know that music engages reward systems, and the more that someone finds it rewarding, you're more eager to engage those systems and boost up those brain regions like the medial prefrontal cortex. So I would say, playing music, but also thinking about kind of titrating it to an individual, and having it available. It's an easy thing, it's accessible, it's non-invasive, and again, it can hopefully be pleasurable as well as have some positive effects on cognitive function. Let's see. Is there any reliable data available to measure the impact of music therapy in our brains and entire bodies? So this is another area that's really interesting, but we don't know. There's not a lot of crosstalk between music therapy and basic researchers. Tufts is lucky because we have a really great occupational therapy department. I actually have a student in my lab now, and we can partner in the psychology and other departments of occupational therapy. So those are the types of studies that we're really looking to do, that we can bridge across therapy and basic science to think about, how can we draw from their experience to design our studies, and how can we give them scientifically based evidence to help direct their own therapy. So I think there'll be more of that to come. And again, there's some exciting work being done here at Tufts investigating that link.
Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Tufts Senior Connection. Liz, we could go on for a long time. I'm sure you've got a whole bank of questions lined up, but we promise everybody that we'll be done in an hour. So we have to call an end to it. But I very much want to extend, on behalf of the Senior Connection, let me extend our warm thanks to Professor Liz Race. Somehow she managed to put together this enormous collection of words, images, and videos, and explained the relationship of music, memory, and the brain in an incredibly informative and entertaining way. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Liz.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you also to Karen McCauley and Rachel Shaw from the Office of Alumni Relations, and Andy Colbert from Tufts Technical Services for producing our program and providing technical support. Now, if anyone out there is interested in joining the Tufts Senior Connection, we would welcome your overture. Just contact either Rachel or Karen. The Senior Connection has one more program to offer for the rest of the year, and it is on Saturday, March 29. To commemorate the 250th anniversary, of the battles of Lexington and Concord, the start of the American Revolution, we are going to visit the Concord Museum, which is a marvelous storehouse of revolutionary artifacts and displays. My favorite item at the museum is a powder horn, which was worn across the body of James Hayward, who approached a home in Lexington on the morning of April 19, 1775, to find a British soldier in his front yard. The two men raised their weapons, fired upon one another, and shot each other dead. The British bullet smashed the powder horn that was worn on Hayward's chest before piercing his heart and killing him. And that powder horn is on display at the Concord Museum, and we will view it. We'll finish the day with a delicious lunch at the famous Colonial Inn. So it's going to be a wonderful day, and watch for notices, and we hope you'll register and join us. This concludes our presentation for today. As usual, you've been a great audience, and we thank you for your good questions, your participation, and your support. If you'd be kind enough to return the survey that you will receive, we promise we will read every one of them. Thank you again, everyone. We hope to see you at our next program, and good evening.